Greetings. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about a topic that seems to be rarely discussed in criminology and criminal justice research, and that is violent and sexual fantasies, or basically fantasies, and how fantasies might be related to criminal activity, specifically violent behaviors. There's a lot of different approaches to studying fantasies. One of the earliest ones I can think of which relates is this book here, Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. I think I bought this when I was about 18, many years ago, back in the 80s, and read it and tried to figure out, well, what does this all mean? And I was just starting out the study of psychology, and I would talk to people about some of their dreams they had, and I try to figure out my own dreams, what they meant. And then I was very fortunate to work with a couple of psychiatrists who were trained in psychoanalysis, and they told me a little bit about interpreting dreams. But then I went back to realize that it wasn't so much imposing my view of what things meant, but trying to understand how the person interprets their dreams, or interprets their fantasies, or interprets or makes sense of their ideas. So this was fun to have. If you're ever on an airplane flying and you have this book, people leave you alone. They won't bother you. They won't talk to you. This book I purchased relatively recently, Dr. Brett Kahr's book, Who's Been Sleeping in Your Head? The Secret World of Sexual Fantasies, where he did an online study of people's sexual fantasies. And Dr. Kahr found some very interesting findings. He found that the fantasies that people have may actually arouse and horrify the person at the same time. He also seemed to have taken more of a psychoanalytic view and looked at how early trauma and aggression related to fantasies later on. He talked about the functions of sexual fantasies, and I would also include violent fantasies as well as sexually violent fantasies in this discussion here, even though his focus was primarily sexual fantasies. But he talked about wish fulfillment, elaboration of situations, communications of inner conflicts, for example, the discharge of aggression, trying to master trauma, the avoidance of painful reality, some of those features. I think sometimes people fantasize out of boredom, and also practicing strategies or techniques of interactions, not just in the sexual or violent realm, but also, someone, for example, is playing guitar or performing in a band. They may fantasize, and daydream and create in their mind the images of themselves successfully playing the guitar and performing in front of an audience. And a lot of interesting themes emerged in Dr. Kahr's book, and he published those. And yes, again, he asked them about their fantasies, and he found a very large range from the relatively mundane to the relatively unusual. I also conducted a study back in the 80s, and the research team asked people to describe their most erotic fantasy. This was actually a survey that was mailed back to a post office box, keeping everything anonymous. And so we have surveys completed, and people wrote back some of their fantasies that related to things that they would like to do, or thought about doing but wouldn't do. And I will not go into details about those, but they're fairly interesting. Again, looking at an early study. This was in 1981 from the Journal of Clinical Psychology, Schlesinger and Kutash's article, The Criminal Fantasy Technique, a comparison of sex offenders and substance abusers. What they basically had, this was kind of like a Rorschach test, if you will. You remember the ink blots from your general psychology course? Anyway, they have cards with drawings of different situations, and they asked substance abusers as well as sex offenders what's going on in the scenario, and they found obviously, I'm sorry, not obviously, but what they found, which was no surprise, is that the substance abusers tend to focus more on drug deals or using drugs, and the sex offenders tend to focus more on deviant sexual behavior. But that's an interesting situation. And they ask questions, and I think that's really what is helpful. They show these basically what they called crime scenes, and ask the subjects to make up a story. Why did he or she do it? Was it planned? What was the person thinking right before or after? How did the person feel before, during, and after? What happens to the person? Will they do it again? So they really ask a lot of nice qualitative questions, and I think that's really a nice route to go in the research as well. And sexual fantasies, violent fantasies, may be related to cultural aspects as well as socialization processes. I know when I was a teenager, what people in my peer group read, I was just studying people back then, I think, wondering what in the world is going on in people's heads. I thought I was a little bit strange till I sat back and watched other people, and I said, I'm actually quite normal. But when I was a teenager, in my peer group, there was a little magazine, and it was called Penthouse Forum, and it was these letters that were written to the magazine that were published, and about people's adventures of sexual interactions that were probably very unusual or rare. And later on, I ran into a man who claims that he wrote most of those and sent them in, and he made them all up. But I don't think that's actually the case. He was just making up a story. But there were some general themes, and that, I think, was one area of some sexual fantasies of society at that particular time. So sometimes it's kind of difficult to try, well, where do we understand all that? And then we turn today in what's going on. The other thing is, when I was a teenager, basically that was it. There were men's magazines, and that was about it in the sexuality domain that I was aware of back then. And then all of a sudden we see the invention of the video camera and VCR. And I was already an adult when that came out. And then we saw the proliferation of adult movies. And also there were a lot of violent movies, and it seemed to become more violent. I can remember watching a movie in the theater called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and another one called Dawn of the Dead, and another one called I Spit on Your Grave. And even though I didn't find those movies to be entertaining or interesting or even well done, what disturbed me is the people in the movie theater munching on their popcorn and enjoying the movie. And later on I would think, well, yeah, this is actually, people go to these horror flicks to see scary things, and for whatever reasons. I've not gone to horror flicks or watched these movies for years and years and years after working in the field and seeing basically some of these things carried out, and the results that just don't want to see these at all, but I always wonder why people like to see those. Well, today, what I remember when I started working in the field is that, and studying sexuality, studying violence, is that people started making homegrown porn with their own video cameras. And what I thought I would see later on is that would take a big hit to the professional adult film industry. And so with the internet, although I was probably wrong because they picked up on using the internet, and the internet changed everything. And I think now we start looking for indicators of fantasies on what's popular, downloaded, or watched more frequently. And so there's some interesting studies. Actually, there's some studies done where Google Analytics were used, and the researchers found out what states had a higher proportion of people watching certain videos, and that's real surprising stuff and everything. And also looking at big data, we have a lot more information. There's a book I wanted to mention. Excuse me while I get this book to show you, because this is, I think, really, this book here, Dr. Ogas and Gaddam's A Billion Wicked Thoughts, What the World's Largest Experiment Reveals About Human Desire. These guys put it all together using technology, the internet, and science and theory to take a look at what people actually like to view, and different interactions and features. I think that this will be a classical book in the future of really what started a lot of these studies. It's a great resource guide. Well, I wondered, how would you even begin to study this in the internet and how that related? And what I found is that there are categories of adult movies. Back in the early days, I think the movies wouldn't have really specific categories. They would just be, often they had a name, and the movies in the 80s, with the advent of the VCR and then later the DVDs, were pretty much, basically people having sex, and they repeat that over and over in the movie, I guess. And there wasn't more specific focus on areas that may be considered fetishes or deviant or anything of that sort. But now we have categories of adult movies, and if you and I was able to take a look at some of the categories that are presented in the marketing through Adam and Eve website, as well as Pornhub, looking at the categories. And what's interesting from a sociological perspective is you can start putting these categories together and you get some pretty specific stuff. And that's my prediction in the future, is people are going to design their own specific targeted porn or adult movies, whatever you want to call that. And so I have a table in some of my research where I looked at the categories, but then I thought you can actually combine these. And there's all kinds of categories, just to mention a few: amateur, animation, big butts, bisexual, celebrity, chunky, couples, female solo, fetish, hairy, how-to, and the list goes on and on and on. And so this, and then I'm thinking, well, you can actually combine those. So you have amateur, bisexual, fetish, couples, and so on. And I think with artificial intelligence and virtual reality, you're going to see that in the future. You already have that in the field there. And of course, my big question is, how is that going to change things? How is it going to make it more complex? How will it change how people fantasize, and then, of course, how they behave? And that brings me to the section on violence. This book I was just impressed and amazed at the research that David Buss in The Murder Next Door, Why the Mind is Designed to Kill, I was just amazed at his and his team's research. You can go online, and that's B-U-S-S, David M. Buss, and he has an online lab and research studies. But this researcher went ahead and brought people in and asked them questions such as, have you ever felt like you wanted to kill someone? How would you kill someone? What stopped you from killing someone? And I think he takes more of a evolutionary model here, but that's excellent to be able to compare and contrast different theoretical approaches, I think. And so their team looked at homicidal fantasies. So that's an interesting area to go into. And so you can look at the book, and it's filled with not only with theories and data, but I think really what I found fascinating were the actual cases and where these people would talk about killing. I'll give you an example from my own work. I interviewed a woman who told me that she wanted to run over this man, that she was at the grocery store and this man walked in front of her car, and she started to fantasize and think about just running him over and killing him, and just his body smashing on the pavement, etc., etc. But she didn't. And to go into more detail about this, what I've discovered was that man was a neighbor that had sexually abused her child. And there was a trial that was going to occur in the future, but she still had to see this guy. And every time she saw him, she wanted to kill him. She wanted to strangle him. She wanted to stab him. She wanted to run him over. And my question was, well, why didn't you? Why didn't you? Not why don't you, but why didn't you? And she said, because I'd be in jail and I would not be able to support and care for my child. So having her child there and wanting to take care of her child and help her child get through the traumatic experience kept her from running over this guy. She said, otherwise, she said, I just mowed the guy down. And so we hear different stories about this. And then there's things on television. Interesting time right now. Whatever, it's the 31st of March, 2018, and just a couple days ago, Walmart pulled their Cosmopolitan magazines from the racks because of the adult content or adult covers or whatever. And I thought that was kind of interesting because I went grocery shopping early this morning at the grocery store, and they cover with these plastic slips magazines. They have a magazine, they have a plastic cover. I mean, you probably noticed that. It's not news for you. Now, my inclination there is at my grocery store, I want to take all the ones of Cosmopolitan, take that cover off, and put it over the chocolate cake. Because I'm looking at that chocolate cake and thinking, chocolate cake. I'd love to have some chocolate cake for breakfast. But, and so there is something, obviously, with that advertising, but I thought, wow, Cosmopolitan. I don't think I've looked at a Cosmopolitan magazine since I was doing research in the 80s. But that seems interesting that they would do that. And there were a lot of claims that Cosmopolitan, had bad modeling effects for youth and things like that. And I'm thinking, do youth actually read Cosmopolitan? I'm more concerned about YouTube and the internet and Facebook and violence in the streets and violent video games. And anyway, so there's some interesting features going on. And also, when people engage in violent behavior, a lot of times I don't think we're going to ask them about their fantasies. Certainly not in the courtroom, probably not in criminal justice-based interviews. It might even seem an inappropriate question to ask, but in clinical interviews, certainly one to ask. Lonnie Athens, in conducting his interviews with violent offenders, asked the question of, why didn't you engage in violence in this particular situation? And I think that's a real important question to ask as well. And of course, we can't see people's fantasies. It's what's going on in one's head. People tend to keep their fantasies to themselves, and unless researchers ask, or sometimes people will help them act out their fantasies, whether sexually or violent. And so the list goes on and on and on. But I think the big question is, when do fantasies become dangerous? Sexual or violent, or sexually violent fantasies become dangerous. And how do we even use this material in research? And is there a point where we begin to say, well, that certain media depictions or stories or certain things in society may encourage violent or deviant fantasies, and that may become a problem. And so, to kind of sum up, the big question really I have, and I post this in various classes, because I would think, in my genocide class, I would ask, are there genocidal fantasies? And how do those fantasies materialize? What is the content? What do they mean to the perpetrators? How do the perpetrators use those fantasies? In the area of sexual violence, I ask, what are the sexual violent fantasies? In the area of homicide studies, what are the homicidal fantasies? And so on. And so I don't claim to have a huge amount of knowledge in this area, and it seems to be an area that is emerging more quickly, and I think a lot of it has to do with the ability to survey large groups using rapid internet technology, and also to data mine what's on the internet as well. So some interesting features to think about, and maybe in the future we'll have more research on this. Maybe one day we'll have even an article, if not a book, on fantasies and criminal justice. And hopefully there would be some applications that would reduce violent behavior. Thank you.